Thank you. So this is what I'm going to talk about today are some results from my PhD that I finished just less than a year ago. This is particularly one chapter, and I'll be looking at the structural plasticity at plot scale and individual scale in Mediterranean forests. This is in Spain. And so forest structure is basically the kind of result of the complex assemblage of individual trees competing for light, and to then formulate a canopy, which is then that important exchange surface, as Marcus was saying. But also within that, individuals can be highly plastic in how they grow into space. So this is a top-down view here from some of the TLS data. This is one plot. These are pines and oaks. And you can see this is a kind of simulation of the data set. If you assume kind of a static crown above a stem, kind of like an inventory, how much overlap you get versus actually what's happening in reality with the TLS data. And there are models out there that assume kind of perfect plasticity, perfect and so on, where trees fill space. And competition for light is key within that. And what's an interesting question is when we think about species diversity within forests, because we see these kind of increased productivity and diversity relationships. So the more species you have, the more productive a forest is. But the exact mechanism behind that is still kind of been alluded to. So those various works that have happened where we talk about kind of the spatial complementarity in tree crowns, lean-to yielding, nice paper here by Tommaso using inventory data where crown count plasticity and the kind of more variety in those shapes, sizes within a canopy leads to better space utilization. And then more recently, we can actually get at structural complexity because we've got these kind of new three-dimensional data sets. So kind of questions I was asking were, do these diverse plots in this Mediterranean forest show this kind of higher crown volume packing, which is kind of what Tommaso was looking at because he had inventory data where it's just the volume of the crowns and there's just more volume within a given volume, there's more tree crowns within it. Or is it actually, do we actually see kind of more of this complexity, which has been tightly linked to productivity in more diverse stands? And then I'll be looking at the individual scale, because we've got individual trees, so we'll be looking at like kind of the role of size and on complexity and how that kind of reflects plot scale complexity. So we're looking at two scales kind of here. This is work in progress. This isn't a review or anything. So my sites are in Spain. So this is part of the FUNDIV network, which is a functional diversity experiment across whole Europe. This is one part of it in the Mediterranean. And I had some more forests kind of in Cuellar, northwest of Alto Tajo, which is kind of more flat riparian. Alto Tajo is very mountainous. And basically have 4 species. So we have 2 pines and 2 oaks. Ilex, which we've seen in other presentations, very drought tolerant. Fahinia, so it's kind of semi-deciduous within the plot. And then we've got Pinus sylvestris and Pine nigris, 2 pine species. And we have 18 mixed plots, 9 pine and 9 oak. So all the trees were individually segmented. I used TreeSeg by Andrew Burt, developed that, but it needed a lot of, as everyone's highlighted, a lot of manual refinement and cleaning. This is a kind of one of the easier plots in the Mediterranean, but when you get to the more stunted forests, it gets really messy. And the 2 metrics I was looking at the plot scale were, as I said before, was this volume packing. So that's basically, you have a given volume, which is the height of the tallest tree down to the lowest branch. So that's the kind of available space for trees to grow in. And you have the kind of ratio of the sum of all the individual volumes to that available space. The 3-dimensional space filling is different in that it's actually taking into account the internal structure of the trees and the plot. And it's just it's the fractal geometry of the point clouds, essentially. So how space filling, in a fractal sense, are these point clouds. And of course, occlusion is an issue here. But so we have these 2 different metrics. And what we found was actually we see that pines, so we actually account for canopy density here, so because obviously density effects will be explain a lot of the variance. But we actually see that pines actually had the greatest packing and complexity for both these metrics relative to mixed forests, and oaks actually had the lowest compared to them. What's interesting is actually if we took average height, tree height, you actually see these interesting relationships here with to the crown packing and 3D space filling. Kind of a more linear relationship here, and this kind of power law-like relationship, which is actually, there's a paper that came out recently, I can't remember who it was, in functional ecology, that found a similar relationship across America between tree height and the kind of fractal geometry of the trees within the forest stand. So, but once we'd accounted for that height effect within some, we did mixed effects models to look at this, we actually didn't see any, with diversity included in that model, pines were kind of equal to the mixed forest, but mixed forests were more complex and filled space more efficiently than the oak-only stands. So we're looking at the genus level the whole time here. So what does that mean when we look at the individual? Does the individual size and complexity reflect what we're seeing at the plot scale? So do individuals within more diverse stands or that are bigger have more complexity? So again, calculated volume on each individual tree and the three-dimensional space filling, but on the individual. And for 3 out of the 4 species, we see a positive relationship between these tree height and complexity. So trees get taller and bigger. We use tree height as a kind of proxy of size in forest ecology. There's more complexity, but not for one of the species. So the deciduous species, that relationship was not there. And this is accounting for plot effects and so on within the model, so differences between the plots. What's interesting is, so we have this relationship with height and complexity with some species, but when you actually look at the relative heights of trees, so a height for a given diameter, breast height, pines are actually shorter for a given dBH in diverse plots, and Quercus vahenia, the deciduous species, is actually taller. So complexity might not be varying between these diverse plots, but then height is affecting complexity, and height is varying according to diversity. And diversity directly had no effect on individual volume or complexity. So across these plots, these diverse plots, individual complexity and volume wasn't actually, there was no significant relationship there. Only height showed any signal. So in summary, kind of, we have height as a strong predictor of this individual complexity, but diversity directly not so. But we now know that diversity is having this varying effect on height between these pines and oaks. And this gets even harder to kind of interpret in this Mediterranean environment where highly seasonal, extremely dry summers, and the topographical variation is quite high as well. So you've got these kind of drought gradients going on in there as well. So I'd like to include some of that information with the National LiDAR Survey. So it's kind of interesting to then think that this kind of plot scale complexity we're seeing in diverse plots, is that arising because of this indirect effect of diversity on height, or is it actually the kind of plot scale assemblage of crowns? That's where the complexity is at. It's not at the individual scale, it's actually once you assemble into that canopy. And just wanted to kind of, where I'd like to go a bit further with this and potentially talk to you guys, is this kind of mixed results from literature. So there's actually been recently a negative relationship between complexity and productivity, because as the complexity increased, you actually get more competition, like asymmetric competition in ecology from bigger trees, and therefore more shading, so productivity is actually lower. So it'd be really interesting to kind of use the three-dimensional information TLS, and this is an example from Bernard's group, where you can maybe get a better measure of actually if a tree is in direct light or is actually being shaded, because we don't have that information in forest ecology, and it'd be, we use quite coarse crown positioning measurements, but as you can see, there are actually trees in the subcanopy here that are getting quite a bit of light, and others that are in the complete shade. So it'd be interesting to look at that, and how we can get some, in ecology, derive some more representative metrics that we can then take forward with that. Yeah, it's just thanks to everyone involved.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? I have a question. So, did you use the same voxel sizes or scales for analyzing complexity in all the species?
Yeah, so that's kind of so it always starts with a voxel that covers the whole tree. Mm-hmm. And then you've got to set the kind of minimum size that you'd want to go down to. So I was quite conservative and went for 5 centimeters because, of course, of occlusion and so on. But then basically it fits boxes progressively smaller and counts them, and the steeper that relationship, the more complex it is. But I used the same method for the individual and also then when I did it on the whole plot as well. So the same voxels. Okay. It went down to the same size. Okay.
So it started by the tree, so depending on the tree it was bigger or smaller, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's always relative to the tree, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Any other question?
Yeah, I have one question, if I can.
Please.
Thank you for the presentation. It's a highly interesting study. I have one comment for mixed forests. I would say that this packing capacity or how this mixed forest behaves will strongly depend on which species form the forest. So it highly depends on the mix of the individual species that form the forest, how they, if they use the same resource.
Yeah.
Or they just split the strategy over the years. So we could see this on the high variability for mixed forests with this packing capacity. So if you can comment on this.
Yeah, so I suppose in this environment it's interesting because we also have, there is such a thing as intercepting too much radiation, so that can be a problem. So some trees, there's been some evidence that actually thrive in shade, but yeah, sure, that kind of having particular species. I mean, I'd like to look at it because what's interesting about that in here is we have the deciduous Fahinian and a lot of kind of data that's been done on the fine scale with sat flux and so on. Very productive in spring because that's when the hydraulic limitation is at its least, but then the solar radiation is coming in and the canopy is in foliage, and actually the productivity lessens then throughout the summer. So I think those interactions between these species along that kind of hydraulic context is really interesting. And that's what I'd like to do with some of this light interception work, is kind of figure out the kind of competitive position of each tree, because we definitely need to figure that out, because the metrics we use at the moment, the course metrics, aren't necessarily reflecting what they think they reflect. But yeah, definitely interesting comment. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.